Hello, everyone. Thank you for being today with us. My name is Haya Atassi. I am from the Public Relations team of the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity. And today I have with me Marie Forestier, who is a researcher and advisor on refugee and migrant issues at Amnesty International. Today, we will be touching upon a very important and timely report that Amnesty International has published, which documented cases of Syrian refugees being arbitrarily detained on terrorism-related charges and tortured in Lebanon. Now, we believe this is a very important report, especially that the situation of Syrian refugees in Lebanon has been exacerbating and deteriorating after the Beirut blast and after the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that Lebanon is home to more than 1 million Syrian refugees, many of whom live in informal settlements, and many also lack any legal documentation in the country. And recently, we have witnessed a rising discriminatory discourse and attacks against Syrians, last of which was the burning of the mini camp in December 2020, camp raids, discriminatory curfews against Syrians, and also not to mention statements by certain Lebanese officials who call for the return of Syrians, for forcibly returning Syrians back to Syria, and even for handing over Syrian detainees to Syrian forces. I would like to give Mary a few minutes to talk about, to discuss some of the findings of her report, to shed light on the most important findings that she thinks we should discuss today, and then I will move on to my questions. So thank you very much, Mary, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your interest. So our research has focused on Syrian refugees who live in Lebanon and who have been arbitrarily arrested because they are accused of terrorism-related crimes. Most of these refugees come from Homs province, and they live in northern Lebanon. All this started because in 2013 and 14, some members of armed groups fled from Syria to Lebanon, and there was a battle in Arsal between the Lebanese military and these members of armed groups. And this has raised attention and sometimes suspicion against Syrian refugees from the Lebanese authorities. And since then, Lebanese authorities have been tracking terrorists in Lebanon, and in this track they have arrested Syrian refugees, and sometimes without a basis in law. And so that's the cases we documented. So basically what our research has found is that hundreds of Syrian refugees have been arrested since as early as 2012 and until the present time for alleged terrorism crimes. They have been arbitrarily detained, interrogated, tortured during their interrogation, detained for a very long time before being brought in front of a judge and before being tried. And they have served sentences in jail based on these trials that have relied on confessions obtained under torture and on very, very little evidence, and even though it has resulted in sometimes year-long detention for Syrian refugees. So our research is based on 26 cases that I directly documented, speaking to detainees, former detainees, including children and women. And I corroborated my findings with Lebanese lawyers who have defended hundreds of Syrian refugees accused of terrorism crimes. And that's why Amnesty International believes that the pattern documented through the direct documentation of the 26 cases reflects a broader pattern that has affected hundreds of refugees, of Syrian refugees, since 2013 approximately. So what has been striking in the violations we documented is that, first of all, Syrian refugees who've been arrested have not been notified for the reasons of their arrest. They have been detained for several weeks without having access to a lawyer or without having access to the outside world, without being able to tell their families where they were. One of the most striking and horrifying violations has been torture that Syrian refugees told us about. The various torture technique and methods used by Lebanese security forces, and especially Lebanese military intelligence, is especially disturbing because it is similar to torture used in Syrian prisons. So you can imagine these people have fled violence and the conflict in Syria. They have fled these violations committed by the Syrian government to find them at risk with the same violations in Lebanon. So this is a huge area of concerns for Amnesty International. Then Lebanese authorities have used these confessions obtained under torture as the primary evidence in the trial they have held. And we believe that this shouldn't have been used as evidence, and authorities have had very little evidence besides these confessions. Also, another main findings and main area of concern is that all these people who are civilians have been tried in front of Lebanese military courts. And Amnesty International believes that civilians should not be tried in front of military courts because military courts don't offer the same guarantee of impartiality, independence, and fair trial than civilian jurisdiction usually do. So these are our main findings. And also I would like to stress that the same treatment has been applied to women who've been detained as well, and children. I documented 4 cases of children who've been arbitrarily arrested, detained, and tortured.
Thank you, Mary. What's actually really striking is that we are hearing about all of these violations against rights of Syrians in Lebanon, despite the fact that Lebanon is party to several international treaties that actually prohibit torture and ill treatment of detainees, such as the ICCPR, Convention Against Torture, and Arab Charter of Human Rights. And now that this report is published and the whole world is aware of the situation, what do you think are the mechanisms that should be put into place to protect the basic rights of these refugees who they themselves fled Syria because of torture, because of persecution, because of harassment, and they sought refuge in Lebanon, and now they are facing a case where they are facing the same treatment from Lebanese authorities? Do you think there are any concrete steps that could be taken? What do you think the Lebanese government's reaction should be? And I would like also to know, now that all of this evidence is out, what is the international community planning to do about this?
So the first thing that the Lebanese authorities should do is to launch an investigation into the allegations of torture, ill treatment, and arbitrary detention. The public prosecutor announced, Lebanese public prosecutor announced last week that such an investigation will be launched. So this is a positive development, but at Amnesty International, what we want is that this investigation is conducted by civilian authorities and not by the military, because the alleged perpetrators cannot be the one conducting investigation, and it is not imaginable that that Syrians who've been subjected to such treatment will come to testify to people that they believe are responsible for this. So investigation is the first step, but an investigation conducted by civilians. And also investigation is key, because without investigation, there is no accountability, and without accountability, such violations can be repeated. So that's why that's the first thing. My second point is, as you rightly pointed, Lebanon is part to various treaties and conventions that obliged Lebanon to respect a number of rights and the obligation of not use torture. So Lebanon should use and implement better the legal framework that it has agreed on and signed on. So, for instance, in 2017, Lebanon passed an anti-torture law. So the law exists. So it's about implementing this law. Also, as Lebanon is part of the Convention Against Torture, it has established a committee that is in charge of reviewing the situation in prisons and inspecting prisons. So these committees should have better access to prisons and being able to monitor even the earlier phases of detention, the phases of interrogation at military intelligence center, and not only at the largest prisons in the country. And finally, something that is very important in order to prevent the use of torture and other ill treatment in detention and during interrogation is the fact that lawyers should have access to their clients from early on in the detention. And a law was passed last September in order to increase the rights of defense and this law repeats these rights, but it hasn't been implemented enough so far. So again, the tool exists, it's about implementing them, and in this case, granting access to lawyers into the early phase of detention from the very beginning.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. The problem is that we are hearing a lot of statements from Lebanese officials themselves who are, I'm sure you heard of Zaina Auka, who was the deputy prime minister in Lebanon, who at the Brussels conference, she called for the return of all Syrian detainees back to Syria, which is extremely dangerous because we all know what the fate of these people would be, especially that they have been accused of terrorism-related crimes, not to mention the Lebanese prime minister, who also asked to give a chance for the return plan for returning Syrian refugees in Lebanon back to Syria. And the argument here that's being used that the issue of Syrian refugees and the return is a humanitarian and it should be isolated from the political solution, which is also very dangerous because the issue of the return of Syrians, it's political at heart. And if there are no conditions to protect these people, they should not return. They should not be deported, because I know that in your report you mentioned cases, you documented cases where Syrians were actually deported back to Syria. So I want here to move to your opinion on these acts of torture, did they only target people who were accused of terrorism charges? So you spoke that these incidents of arbitrary detentions increased after the Battle of Arsal. And do you think this is more of a political issue related to what happened in Arsal and related to, falsely accusing these people of terrorism, of the terrorism charges? What do you think is the background of this? And do you think there is actually a chain of command to this bad and ill treatment of refugees? Do you believe it's actually something systematic? Or do you think, no, if we have an investigation, if the Lebanese government starts an investigation, maybe there is a chance at actually fixing this?
So there are a lot of questions here. First of all, I focused on documenting detention of Syrian people who've been accused of terrorism-related crimes. So I didn't document the detention for other reasons. So I cannot say if torture and other ill treatments also happens in different cases. What I can say is that for people accused of terrorism-related crimes, it was really systematic. Among the 26 cases I documented, only one person was not subjected to torture or other ill treatment, and because it was a very, very unique case, let's say. In terms of chain of command, it is difficult to say for us because I don't have the information to make such a statement. But what I can say is that the fact that it took place in every center where people have been detained, and so in different centers, not just in one or two places, but in all of them before detainees appeared in front of a judge first, and the fact that it has happened constantly for all people I interviewed and who were detained from 2014 until 2019, so over 5 years, the fact that it happened for all of them except one shows that there is a systematic use of torture. And also this documentation builds up on previous work by Amnesty International that has also documented the use of torture against Lebanese people, against journalists, or against people who take part to protests. So this torture and other ill treatment is part of the method used in Lebanese detention. Now, I would like to. Yeah. No, I mean, I wanted to say something about the issue of return you mentioned before, but if you have a follow-up question.
No, please go ahead.
About return, because that's a very important point, and there are two issues about return. There is the issue of deportation of people who've been detained, and there is the issue of return in general. About people who've been detained, this is true that I documented several cases of Syrian men who served a sentence in jail and then were ordered to be deported to Syria. This is absolutely illegal. This is against international law. No one should be deported to a place where he or she is at risk of serious human rights violation, regardless of the fact that this person may or may not have committed a crime. So even though someone served a sentence in prison, even though someone was sentenced for a crime, it is illegal to deport her or him afterwards. That's the first thing. And as you said, and as we know, there is a huge risk for people for Syrian who are deported to Syria. So this is a clear violation. This is a clear violation of human rights law by Lebanon, first of all. Second of all, regarding return in general, Amnesty International believes that the conditions for free, voluntary, and dignified return are not met in Syria at the moment. The Syrian government has committed a large range of violations of human rights law and humanitarian law, as well as other armed groups present in Syria. So the conditions are not safe enough for Syrian people to return to Syria at the moment, and any return would be premature.
Exactly, and this actually, this is why we always argue that the issue of return is political at its heart, and contrary to what the Lebanese officials are saying, that we cannot wait for a political solution to happen in Syria. We are being burdened by the refugee presence. Well, it's very dangerous to even consider returning refugees, because one important thing is the main driver of displacement in Syria was the Syrian regime. People did not flee because of the economic situation. They did not flee because of environmental issues. People fled because of persecution. People fled because of torture. People fled because of the practices of the regime. And as long as the Syrian regime is still in power, and as long as there is no genuine political solution, we cannot talk about a return. And this was basically our position when Russia called for the return conference, and it was held in Damascus. And we saw that as an attempt to legitimize the return at the time when there is no genuine solution for the people to return back to Syria. I would like here to ask you about. So on 18th of January, the United Nations Human Rights Council Working Group on Universal Periodic Review held a session to discuss the records of Lebanon's human record, and the Lebanese government sent a report to the council of their record of human rights, and they spoke about Syrian refugees in only 3 paragraphs, which was very surprising for us. They discussed refugees in terms of education. They discussed the fact that they need more funding for refugees, and they said that that the Syrian refugees, that the international organizations should uphold their responsibilities and continue funding Lebanon to tackle the issue of displacement. But what's surprising for us is that they did not at all talk about the fact that the Syrians do not have legal documentation in the country. They did not talk about the fact that Syrians live in informal camps. They did not talk about the discrimination, about all the dire situation that Syrians have been enduring in Lebanon. And this brings me to my question: do you believe that any aid do you believe that international donors should condition their aid to Lebanon on the respect of rights of refugees?
That's a difficult question. At Amnesty International, we're not calling to condition aid to the respect of human rights, but we are strongly urging donors and foreign countries to urge Lebanon and other hosting countries to respect and fulfill human rights of refugees. That's part of their obligations, and we repeated this call at the occasion of the Brussels V conference a week ago. But we still believe that also European governments and donor countries should share the responsibility of taking care of refugees and should increase resettlements and also continue supporting countries, neighboring countries who are hosting the largest number of Syrian refugees and who are making the biggest efforts supporting them.
Thank you. I want to ask a question about the UNHCR. So, you know that UNHCR has stopped registering refugees in Lebanon, and the fact that they stopped registering these refugees, does it make these people lose their right as their protection as refugees? Because we have so many Syrians in Lebanon who are not registered. That's a fact. But then we have also the Lebanese government saying that, okay, I cannot protect them, I cannot provide them the aid that they need, and all of that. Do you think that the UNHCR here has a responsibility to protect these refugees? Do you believe that? How do you think this dilemma should be solved?
This is also a difficult question. So, as you said, in 2015, at the request of the Lebanese government, UNHCR stopped registering Syrian refugees arriving in Lebanon. First of all, the protection is not directly related to the registration with UNHCR or the status of refugees. And as I said before, governments and including hosting countries, and so Lebanon, have obligations towards refugees, towards the people who are living in their country, and they should respect and fulfill their human rights. So whether or not they are registered, whether or not they have refugee status or whatever card they have, their rights should be respected, they should be protected, and they should be able to live in decent conditions. So that's the first and the most important thing. Second, this is true that now the majority of Syrian people living in Lebanon don't have a legal residency permit and don't have a legal status, and it puts them at risk, because the main fear of Syrians living in Lebanon today is to be arrested at a checkpoint if they are asked for their ID documents. So yes, it puts them at risk, because we documented what's happening to people to Syrian refugees who are detained. So there is a clear risk if they are arrested for not having papers. Now I think it is the responsibility. It is a shared responsibility to protect them and to provide them with a legal status and decent living conditions. And this is a shared responsibility between UNHCR, Lebanon, and donor countries and European countries as well.
Yeah, and I would also like to mention here that on the 19th of November, the European Court of Justice ruled that refusal to perform military service in Syria gives entitlement to recognition as a refugee. And so many of the Syrians who are in Lebanon who are sometimes being deported are being sent back to a place where they will be persecuted. And the ECJ based this decision on the fact that those who refuse to perform military service under the same regime may be perceived as opposing the regime and hence would face persecution on their return. And this comes, and despite the fact that international human rights law has the principle of non-refoulement, which guarantees that no one should be returned to a country where they could face cruel and inhumane treatment. That's from one side in terms of international law. And then from the other side, when we see the discourse in Lebanon, and which from Lebanese officials or from the society, and which increases the fear that the more we are witnessing these statements and this discourse against Syrians, the more we will see violence against them, and the more we will see cases of them being returned back to Syria, and especially I'm sure you heard of the case of the mother and her children who really was suffering in Lebanon due to the economic situation in the country, and she was trying to go back to Syria through smuggler routes, and she died on the way. She froze to death with her children. So who do you think has the power and the mandate to protect Syrians from these life-threatening journeys and to protect them from either being deported by the government or from them being forced to return back to an immature and unsafe return to Syria? Do you think the Lebanese government can do this? Do you think the burden is more on the international community to really take, other than advising, to really take concrete steps to protect these people?
Again, I believe this is a shared responsibility. So on the first hand, the primary responsibility lies with the Lebanese government that should not deport or force to return any Syrian refugees to Syria, because yes, they are at risk of serious human rights violation, and this is against international law. So there is no question about that. The Lebanese government should not do so. Then we should admit that Lebanon is facing a set of challenges at the moment, and hosting 1.5 million additional people brings additional challenges to the existing challenges in Lebanon at the moment. And that's where the international community has a responsibility. European countries and other Western countries have resettled a very low number of refugees from the region, and they can and should do more, and they should also better support Lebanon and neighboring countries so that they can offer better living conditions to refugees, so that they don't feel that they have no other choice than returning to Syria.
So basically, we're talking about the international community sharing the burden with Lebanon, because we are all aware that Lebanon is already facing a lot of challenges and already has a large number of refugees. So the international community should take part in this burden and support Lebanon, maybe take in some refugees, maybe support with financial aid to civil society organizations which help refugees. But we should continue our advocacy work that Syrians should not be deported to Syria, that the situation in Syria is very unsafe, and that the return of refugees is an essential part of any political solution in Syria, and no return should happen unless there are conditions of a safe environment. That's it from my side. Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.